and about all the lovely critters that could be living in there. So yeah, really excited to have Megan Gimber joining us today from People's Trust for Endangered Species. Megan collaborated with us on the Hedgerow module in the Nature Friendly Grounds toolkit. So we worked quite a lot last summer with her around thinking about hedgerow specific actions, how we can embed that into the toolkit, making sure that we had some good advice for all of you. And we've been working with Megan for a longer time actually as well for our hedgehog friendly programme in terms of obviously hedgerows being a super important habitat for hedgehogs too. So it's been a long running collaboration actually. So yeah, really a pleasure to introduce you all to Megan. So I'll hand over to Megan to introduce herself and get started.
Thank you very much. My name is Megan. I work for a charity called People's Trust for Endangered Species, where I basically just work on hedges. I think my technical job title is Key Habitats Officer, but most people just refer to me as the hedgerow geek because most of what I do is hedgerows. Hedgerows being a very undervalued, underappreciated habitat that have an enormous potential for really positive large-scale change. So I'm going to run through quite a lot about hedgerows in this session. I'm going to speak really quickly because I've got a lot to say in 45 minutes. If I go too fast, please just shout at me and tell me to slow down. Yeah. So why hedgerows? Really, the closer you look at a hedge, the better they get. And we've looked pretty closely at them. Hedges are just amazing for wildlife. There's one study published by a chap called Robert Walton, pictured here on this slide, which said he looked at one hedge, 85 meters long, and found 2,070 different species in that one hedge, which is quite a remarkable amount. Really, that's comparable to ancient woodland. That's comparable to some of our most biodiverse and some of our richest habitat in the country. So we know they can be absolutely gold dust for wildlife if we manage them well, if we plant them well, if we make sure that we understand how wildlife use them. And that's really crucial. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how wildlife mainly uses hedgerows, and that really helps us to understand where we might plant them, what species we might put in them, how we manage them going forward, and how we know they're in a good condition to support wildlife. And hopefully I'll show you all of the other things that can benefit from that as well. In urban areas, in schools, in grounds, you know, these fantastic habitats have so many uses. So the first way that we think wildlife use hedgerows is for a home. So this time of year, you can't really escape birds doing their thing. They're nesting in hedgerows everywhere. And it's somewhere that things will literally physically live. So birds will be nesting. We know dormice live in hedgerows, hedgehogs live in hedgerows, loads of insects live in hedgerows. In fact, I think of Robert Walton's 2,070 species, a fair chunk of those were insects. We also know that wildlife use hedgerows as a complementary habitat. Now, this is a bit of a cheat because this means lots of different things, but basically if a species doesn't necessarily live in the hedgerow, but it still uses that hedgerow. So this might be it feeds off the hedgerow. So pollinators will be at hedgerows at this time of year for the blossom. Birds will use them later on in the year for the berries and for the fruit that they provide. But things will also use them for shelter. So this is a picture of a barn owl. Barn owls obviously don't live in hedgerows. They live in barns and hollow trees. But this barn owl flies up and down a hedgerow where not only does it feed, because hedges have an awful lot of small mammals in them, but it also has the shelter so that it can hear. Barn owls obviously use their sense of hearing to hunt really well. And on a windy night, they can only hear where they've got some shelter as well. And of course, we know wildlife also uses hedges as corridors. This is, I think, probably the most famous use of hedgerows, wildlife corridors, connectors, green arteries, that sort of thing. And they're a really fantastic way at helping our native ecology move from one place to another. And these natural corridors are really important to connect populations of wildlife that would otherwise be isolated and therefore vulnerable. So these corridors are really important. With the best will in the world, what happens in between hedges, whether that be, I don't know, a cricket pitch, a field with crops or housing or, you know, or anything, is not always the most hospitable for wildlife to cross. So actually it's the hedges, it's the edges, it's these wonderful patches of habitat that run as a network around that help connect wildlife up. And this is really important for quite a lot of our wildlife. There are loads of species that actually need hedges for all three of these main ecological roles. I think bats are a good example because we get bats in all sorts of locations, in urban, semi-urban and rural areas. Bats will use hedgerow trees to roost in. They will feed off the insects that a hedgerow generates. They're helped by the fact that hedgerows provide shelter, meaning that the insects will be on the wing, even on a sort of wet or windy or inclement night. And they also use our hedges a bit like we use roads to sort of navigate themselves around the countryside. They echolocate off the hedge lines and the hedge tree lines to actually get from their roosting to their feeding sites. So really important for all three main ecological roles of a bat. And here we have the hedgehog, which also uses a hedge for all three of those main ecological roles. It will live in a hedge. It will put its breeding nest at the base of a hedge, as well as its hibernation nest in a hedge, particularly if you've got a nice hedge with thick, dense stuff right at the bottom, lots of bramble, that sort of thing. So it will physically live there. It will feed from a hedge, so hedgerow margins, especially if you've got a wonderful tussocky grass and good population of macroinvertebrates, it will feed from the base and the margins of the hedge. And it will also use hedgerows as connectivity. So in more urban areas, they will use things like garden fences, but in areas where they've got hedges have a dual purpose, feeding and connectivity. They like to move around the countryside, sort of bimbling along linear features, and hedges provide that perfectly because they also provide a little bit of shelter and a little bit of protection as and when they need it. So how hedges are so good for wildlife, I think is, for me, absolutely fascinating. Especially because hedges aren't a man-made habitat. Hedges are what we call a semi-natural habitat, which means they don't really occur in nature, but they mimic what we see at the edge of a woodland. So we call them a woodland edge ecotone. And that means they've got elements of woodland in their hedgerow trees, elements of flowering scrub and that sort of scrubby texture of a hedge, and elements of pasture at the hedgerow margins and at the base. And this combined is an absolutely fantastic habitat for nature. And it's really interesting to see. So not only does a hedgerow provide for what we normally call woodland species, for example, I think 80% of what we normally call woodland birds are supported by hedgerows as well. But actually this combination together, the woodland flowering scrub and pasture together, is really very powerful for a huge proportion of our native ecology, which is really interesting. And doing a little bit of a deep dive onto why that might be, actually, the most up-to-date thinking is that pre-agriculture, our landscape did not look like closed canopy woodland from coast to coast. We actually had large megafauna migrating up and down the country, causing merry chaos, munching, browsing, knocking things over, eating, then moving on and allowing things to encroach again. So we would have had an awful lot of woodland, potentially not closed canopy woodlands, but an awful lot of woodlands. We would have also had more open areas with scrub that came and went as these large herds of herbivores moved around. We'd have wonderful amounts of succession. So scattered trees, scrub coming and going as the herbivores did, patches of open grassland in amongst an awful lot of woodland as well. So an awful lot of actually what we would describe as this woodland edge ecotone. We only really find this at a woodland edge now because we get closed canopy woodland, then a fence line, and then a field. But that's not, again, that's a man-made creation. A much more natural approach is this sort of mosaic of habitats as these different habitats bleed into one another. So what we've got when we've got hedgerows actually replicates this quite archaic structure. It's got scattered trees, it's got scrub, it's got that wonderful successionary dynamic texture to it, it's got the margins on either side. It actually quite well replicates the structure of what we think pre-agricultural wildwood of this country used to look like. And if you think this is what a huge proportion of our ecology adapted to, it makes sense then that hedges, even though they are for all intensive purposes, a man-made construct, do so well at suiting our native ecology. So what do we want from a hedge, and what does wildlife need from a hedge, and what can a good hedge look like? So number one, we like a good mix of plant species, not just 100% hawthorn hedges or 100% anything hedges. A good mix of species is really fantastic for wildlife. Now, this is for a few reasons. Number one, each of those different shrubs will flower and fruit at a different time of year. This year we've already seen we had the blackthorn, then we had the hazel, we had the cherry plum, and now we've got the maythorn, the hawthorn out. So we have this sort of succession of flowering, which means actually our hedges flower for a longer proportion of the year, and then they will fruit for a longer proportion of the year as well. So a better provision for wildlife with a mix of species. Number two, each of our different UK native shrub species will have some insects that specialise on feeding on just that plant. One fantastic example is the brown hair-streaked butterfly, which lays its eggs, and the larvae only feed on blackthorn, and blackthorn of a particular stage as well. So actually, the more different species we cram into our hedgerow mixes, the more specialists that means our hedge is available to. Now, if we're thinking of hedgehogs, this is also really important. Hedgehogs need particular types of leaves to build their nests. And when they're building their hibernation nests, they won't build them out of just hawthorn leaves. Hawthorn leaves are no good for hedgehogs. They love bramble, and they'll use bramble leaves, but they also need those bigger leaves from other species. So again, making sure you've got a mix of species in there will not only diversify the insects that are available for the hedgehogs to eat, but will also make sure that they've got enough nesting materials as and when it comes to hibernation nesting. Height and width. So hedges, the bigger they are, largely, the more wildlife they support. Now that comes with a caveat. We don't want all of our hedges big. We want a mix of different heights and shapes and whatnot. But the bigger a hedge is, the more complex habitat it provides, as well as a bigger hedge habitat by volume. So largely, we don't just want to keep them at that 4-foot level if we can avoid it. We want a few that are a little bit bigger as and where we can. And I'll mention a bit later on what we can do to actually make sure that those different heights, those different widths and structures actually benefit the location and benefit the purpose that we've got them for. And as I said, we don't want all of our hedges the same height and width. We want structural complexity. So we do want some hedges small. Some species respond to small hedges, neatly trimmed, neatly clipped hedges. But we also want some big. We want that whole diversity of hedgerow structure. And luckily, that's actually what we get when we manage them on the hedgerow life cycle, which I'll speak a little bit more about later. We want our hedges to have good connectivity. So this means we want our hedges to connect to each other. As you can see, not all hedges do. They get a little bit gappy over time. And we also want them to connect up other habitats. So it's worth thinking in your grounds, on your site, which other habitats have you got? And are they well enough connected? Is there a way for wildlife to find that site, to leave that site, to connect that to other populations that site might have? Hedgerows are fantastic corridors for that connectivity. And really important for things like hedgehogs. Again, hedgehogs like to bimble along a linear feature. Hedges are obviously the perfect one for that. Next up, we want a good margin. Now, it is tempting to put hedgerow anywhere where it might fit, but it's also worth giving them enough space to make sure that we've got a good margin in there. So this margin, as you can see, the blackthorn and the bramble have suckered out quite a lot. And this is absolutely fantastic for wildlife. Now, this won't be appropriate everywhere. Certainly, this won't be appropriate in a sports grounds or in certain parts of your grounds. But as and where we can accommodate a wider margin and accommodate some of that, the bleeding edges where the hedge kind of bleeds into that margin, this is absolutely stonking for wildlife. Over 40% of the priority species that live in hedgerows depend on the margin. They depend on the margin for overwintering, for feeding. Over winter, the margin and the base of the hedge is where an awful lot of our hedgerow wildlife will be. Also very important for hedgehogs, this is where they will be feeding, particularly where you've got that hedge bleeding into that margin. That will also be where they all put their nests as well, particularly their summer nests. Next up, we want our hedges to go all the way down to the ground. Now, this seems like a bit of a silly one, but it's really very important. The hedges on the left, as you can see, they've got a bit leggy. There's a stalk, and then there's the leafy branchy stuff on top. I call them lollipop hedges, because it's like a lollipop on top of a stick. Now, these are useless for hedgehogs. So not only at the ground level, they're not creating that shelter, that sort of humidity, and the cover that a hedgehog will need to nest, but they also don't create the best environment for hedgerow insects as well. The macro insects, of course, being what hedgehogs will feed on. So I like to think about hedgerows as Victorian ladies. We like them to have skirts all the way down to the floor, with no scandalous ankles on display. This is really very, very important for hedgehogs. So keep an eye out for your hedge bottoms. Hedge bottoms are a very crucial part of understanding a hedgerow. Next up, we also want hedgerow trees. Now, these are really important for wildlife. So over half of the priority species associated with hedgerows depend on hedgerow trees being there. So they provide signposts, they provide territory markers, which are really important bird behaviours. They provide extra nesting opportunities for birds, for bats, all sorts of things. But they also provide a more reliable source of food. Now, the hedge below will be trimmed. Most hedges do get trimmed, and that's absolutely fine. We need to maintain the structure, the size, and just keep them in the place that we've allocated them. But when we trim our hedgerows, we are massively reducing the amount of blossom and fruit that they provide. So, of course, having hedgerow trees within our hedges, they actually are unaffected by the management of the hedge below and will merrily flower and fruit, irrespective of how we're managing them. Now, hedges, I think it's really interesting to look at the origins of our hedges, where they come from, because that has a massive impact on what's in them and how valuable they often are. A lot of people think all of hedgerows came from the enclosure period. The enclosure period was a couple of hundred years ago, where there was an awful lot of land enclosures and we planted mostly hawthorn hedgerows. But actually, nationally, over half of our hedges are much older than that. We've got hedges that go back to between 5,000 and 6,000 years old in Cornwall. We've got Bronze Age hedges on Dartmoor and in Devon. In Devon, 2/3 of our hedges are medieval or older. Now, these hedges might be some of the hedges that are within your grounds, within your campuses, as and where campuses expand and use old agricultural land. If those hedgerows were retained, it's worth looking at those hedges, looking at the species composition, what's in there, to work out whether the hedges that you've got could be some of our ancient ones. And when you look at our ancient hedges, they are stonkingly impressive. They might have ancient woodland indicators chock-a-block at the bottom, like this one down at the bottom left of the screen. And this isn't surprising, really, when you think how ancient quite a lot of our hedgerows are. They've got huge amounts of diversity, both in terms of species and in terms of genetic diversity within those old hedges. So absolutely worth looking out for and paying attention to and making sure that we restore. So why do we have hedges? I think it's worth looking at how hedges benefit us, because we don't have hedges for wildlife. I've just spoken about how good hedges are for wildlife, but that's not why we planted them. That's not why we have them on farms. That's not why we have them on grounds. We largely have them because of their utility to us. Now, I'm going to go through a few of the benefits that hedgerows provide. You will notice that most of my photos have livestock in them, because normally I present this with farmers in mind. But actually, you can just as easily substitute the cows and sheep in these photos with people, because the benefits are very similar. So number one is shelter. Hedges provide fantastic shelter, and this is really useful, depending on where you are, to extend the season within which you can actually use those grounds. So, when we get the spring storms and those autumn winds. Similarly, shade. We know we're going to have more intense heat waves. They're going to be hotter and they're going to be extended heat waves, and we know building in shelter to the spaces that we use is going to be really important, not just for cow welfare but also for human welfare, because we we will need more shade in those times of heat wave. More shelter. Pest control. So I don't know how much pest control you do on your grounds, but certainly we know within the agricultural systems that hedgerows are a fantastic source of natural pest control. So we've got here a ladybird larvae, but this could be lacewing larvae, it could be predatory beetles or spiders. Hedges are chock-a-block full of mini predators. I tell you what, about this time of year, maybe give it another week or so, there will be ladybird larvae aplenty. And it's one of my favourite things to do on a spring day is get a magnifying glass and a cup of tea and just watch them hunt. They are fantastic predators. Anyway, anywhere that you have use for predator control, hedgerows are a fantastic source of those fantastic little beasties that will go and feast on aphids and other unwanted pests. Pollinators as well. We need to make sure that we've got resource for pollinators all year round. And again, this comes down to having a diversity of shrubs to make sure we've got pollen and nectar available, throughout that early spring season, and also places for our pollinators to live. Most bee species, most natural pollinator species will not live on cropped ground, will not live on a sports pitch, but they will live on the hedges that surround them. So making sure we provide places for them to build their nests and their overwintering sites. They help reduce soil erosion, but they can also help reduce flooding. And this is because hedges and hedgerow roots run deeper, and the quality of the soil below a hedgerow is so much better that the infiltration rates are much higher. So wherever we've got problems with water, with water pooling, actually thinking about how we can slow the flow of water using hedgerows, using trees, using that root system can be really important. Now, this is really important particularly in places like the contours of hills and places where we get an awful lot of runoff. Pollution as well, and this may or may not be important for the exterior of your grounds, but making sure that we have a barrier between where we're breathing and where all the pollutants are. So if you've got a main road near your grounds, if it's next to a play area or a sports pitch, making sure that you've got a barrier of plants, shrubs, trees that can actually soak up and intercept some of that pollution, the less of it we actually have to breathe in. And carbon as well. I'm going to touch on carbon in a little bit more detail, actually. So carbon isn't one of the primary reasons that we planted hedges, of course, but we're slowly realizing quite how valuable they are in terms of carbon storage. So hedges store carbon in the trees, in the shrubs, in the roots, but also in the soil around them. And the most recent research shows that they actually store more carbon than forest on average. An old hedgerow will store more carbon than forest per hectare on average. And this is because they actually chuck a huge amount of carbon underground, both in the roots and in the soil around them. So really good at help mitigating climate change. Now, we lost a huge amount of hedges. Last century, we lost, well, about a third, maybe up to half of our hedges in some areas. So it's really important that we start planting them back. And luckily, people are planting hedgerows everywhere. I'm seeing a huge interest in hedgerow planting, and I think this is absolutely fantastic. We do need to realise, however, that we also need to make sure that we manage our remaining old hedges in a way that we don't lose those. So for me, the priority is always look after what we've got and then plant new ones. So understanding what we've got is really important. We had a recent UK-wide study come out 2 years ago that demonstrated what the condition of our hedgerows. And this is a study that's been running since the 70s. Every 10 years, they do the same survey all across the UK, and they come back and basically say, well, hedges are in a bit of trouble. Hedges are in a bit more trouble. Hedges are really struggling now. And it seems like every decade, the picture seems to get slightly worse and slightly worse. The most recent one actually showed a little bit of good news as well. We like to highlight the good news as well as the bad. It showed that agri-environment schemes, so different ways that we trim and rejuvenate our hedges, largely linked to the agri-environment schemes from DEFRA, are improving overall hedgerow condition. They're improving them for wildlife, and they're more likely to get the vital restoration that they need. The not so good news is that despite a huge amount of planting, we don't actually have any change in the extent of hedgerows nationally, which indicates that despite planting a huge amount of hedgerows, that's probably actually the rate that we're losing existing hedges. So we need to look at why we're losing the existing hedges and how we stem that loss if our new planting is to make any difference. They showed that 61% of new hedges in 2023 existed in the 2007 survey, but had died off since then and had to be replanted. So an awful lot of these new hedges we're putting in are actually just replacing the loss of our old ones. So it's really important that we actually step in, look at why we're losing our old hedges. And some of these hedges might be 1,000 years old, and we need to stem that loss before we can count any new hedges as additionality. So how we do that all comes down to management. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to run through very, very quickly what we think good management looks like, right from the beginning of the cycle all the way to the end. So first of all, if you're going to plant a new hedge, fantastic, go ahead. That's a great thing to do. How do we get a good hedge out of it? We can't just plant it, let it get up to the height and trim trim it there. We need to actually grow this hedge. We need to establish this hedge, and this takes good management. So there are 3 options from my point of view to grow a good new hedge. Option number 1, you plant it, you leave it for 10 years. Leave it to do its own thing, to grow big and tall and whatnot. Then you lay it. Now this is called a maiden lay, because the world of hedgerows is full of smutty terminology. Don't ask me why. What this does is fantastic. This laying, for anyone that hasn't done this before, is where you cut every single stem right at the bottom, 80% of the way through, and then flop the top bit down. That stays alive because it's still attached to the roots, and you bind it together to create a really thick, robust, dense hedge. It's fantastic for wildlife. That stays alive, and that will regrow. But you also get regrowth from the bit that you cut right at the bottom. So every stem you plant turns into a multi-stemmed bush right from the ground level, right where nature needs it. And again, the bottom of your hedge, I can't express enough, is the most important bit. The bottom of the hedge, the health of the base of your hedge, is absolutely crucial. And then what we like to see from there is trimming this every single year, incrementally higher and wider, to encourage branching, to encourage that thick, dense structure that's so good for nesting birds, but also makes it a good hedgerow for our uses as well. A better windbreak, better for privacy, better for all manner of things. Option 2 is very similar. You plant it, leave it, and then coppice it. Now, depending on what part of your grounds you are planting these hedges, this may or may not be appropriate, because you do need to make sure that once you've coppiced that hedge, you protect it from people trampling over it or wildlife browsing. But if you can do that, then you can incrementally trim the regrowth and again create a wonderful dense hedge that's got branching density right from the bottom right to the top. And again, because you've coppiced it, you've forced every single stem to turn into a multi-stemmed bush, which means you get that thickness, that density right from the ground up. Option 3, if you don't have the time to do option 1 or 2, because they can be quite intensive, is just incrementally trim it from the start. So cut it in year 1, in the winter, higher and wider each year, higher and wider, to create that density. Now this hedgerow here is what option 1 can look like. This hedge is 12 years old. It was planted, left for 10 years, and this is after its 2nd incremental trim. It's quite big. They wanted a big hedge in this instance, so they've done their increments quite large. But actually you can take it a bit slower than that and do smaller increments, creating a tidier, smaller, neater hedge, if that is what you need in your area. But it's hard to think of a better hedge at 12 years than what was produced here. Now, what we don't want to see, and I thoroughly encourage you to avoid this option, is planting a hedge, letting it get up to the height that you want it, and then trimming it there. Because a hedgerow will put on its branching growth just below where you trim it, because that's how they respond hormonally to the growing tips being taken off. So what you're doing is you're weighting all of that branching growth just to that one trim line, which means it's hollow at the bottom, dense at the top, a little bit top heavy, and in a very short amount of time, you'll actually start seeing that you're losing stems. Each stem is still a single stem. You've probably got a big chunk at the bottom where it doesn't have any branches, especially if you've had to use tree tubes. And essentially, it doesn't make the best hedge. So if you're going to plant hedges, have a good think about what method you're going to use to establish them, to rear them, to bring them to maturity. This hedge was planted, let to grow to the height that we wanted it, and then trimmed at that height. And you can see this hedge is also about 12 years old, by the way. You can see that this doesn't make a good hedge. It's thin at the bottom, it's still got its spirals on, it's already losing stems, and it just hasn't got the structure needed both for our uses, but also for wildlife. So what about hedges that we already have? A lot of people expect me to say it's better not to trim our hedges, but I won't. We do need to manage our hedges, otherwise our hedges don't stay as hedges. They turn into a line of trees. They lose all of that valuable scrubbiness. All of the scrub species tend to be lost because they're shade intolerant, and you end up like this, which is a line of trees which is ever getting more gappy. Now, this line of trees is not as good for carbon. It's not as good for wildlife. It's certainly not as good for things like hedgehogs. They've got no shelter here at all, and all the growth that they need is up here rather than down at the ground level, which is where they need it. So we do need to manage hedges. Again, hedges are not a natural habitat, so it's no good to just leave them to nature. They are a semi-natural habitat, a man-made habitat. So we need to make sure that our management does right by their structure and what wildlife need of them. So trimming a hedge, we can also over trim, and I'm sure most of you have seen hedges that look like this as well. Just as we can't leave a hedge without any management, we also can't repeatedly trim our hedge to the same height without seeing structural decline. And largely this is because a hedgerow thrives from dynamism. It needs to change. A hedgerow is what we call a successionary habitat, in that it changes through time. And actually the key to its wildlife success is that change. So we can't keep them to any one height or width perpetually through trimming without seeing decline and eventually loss. This is a hedge actually up in Cumbria, and bear with me, the bit of artistic license here. This is what we would expect over time if this hedge was to only be managed by constant trimming at that one height. Year after year, we will just lose one stem, another stem here or there, particularly in the heat waves, but eventually that hedge will disappear. Now, hedges like this probably still aren't unfamiliar to you. We see hedges like this everywhere, largely because hedges that are only under a trimming regime will eventually all turn to this. So we've got a couple of options then. If trimming our hedge at the same height and every year together makes them useless for wildlife and eventually kills them, we've got two good options. We either don't trim them at the same height or don't trim them every year. This is an example of how much more blossom you can get by delaying the trimming to 2 or 3 years. Hedgerows put on their blossoming and their fruiting growth on second-year wood. So actually, by delaying that trim, we can encourage more blossom, more berries, and much better for wildlife. And of course, if our hedges aren't blossoming at this time of year, then they're not going to be fruiting in a few months' time either. And again, that massively reduces how valuable they are for wildlife. And again, this is really important for things like hedgehogs, because hedgehogs rely on macroinvertebrates, and we know that invertebrate diversity and abundance are increased when they've got things to feed on. So a lot of our insects will rely on the pollen in the early season and the fruit in the late season and the cover. Our second option is just not to trim our hedges at the same height each year. Again, when we cut them to the right back to the wick every single year, we're cutting off the blossoming and the flowering and the fruiting growth. So one option is to actually just trim them slightly higher and slightly wider each year, which means they've always got that second-year wood around the outside that will blossom and fruit. Now, this does mean your hedge will get slightly bigger each year, but this might just be 5 or 10 or 15 centimetres, and largely that can be accommodated if we do it sensitively. This is what a bog standard boring hawthorn hedge can look like when it's incrementally trimmed. This hedge is flailed every single year, but look how much blossom and berry growth we got off this hedge. Now this hedge is in A shape, so we get extra brownie points for that, but it's also trimmed higher and wider incrementally each year. And lastly, all hedges need to go through rejuvenation, and sometimes before we do that we might just want to give it a rest, let it go, let it turn into a beautiful sort of bushy wildlife friendly hedge for a few years, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, whatever your space can accommodate. After that, this is the crucial bit, they need to be laid. Hedges don't live forever. No single bush in a hedge will live forever. Yet how do we have a hedge that might be 1,000 or 2,000 years old? That's because traditionally, once per generation, we lay that hedge. And again, when you lay a hedge, you cut it right at the bottom, flop the top bit over and bind it, and then the regrowth from the bottom gives you that next generation. It forces another generation for that hedge to live and that another generation of that hedge to flourish and support wildlife. It's a fantastic act of rejuvenation and restoration, and it is an art that is actually coming back in force at the moment, which is fantastic and much needed. So our hedges struggle if we trim them too long, that bit on the left. They struggle if we don't trim them at all, that picture on the right. And they do really, really well if we allow them to go through succession and then reset them through laying. And that's essentially all hedgerow management needs to be. We can trim them, absolutely. We can make them the shape, the size, the type of hedge that we want. But at some point we need to let them grow out, and then we need to lay them in order to force about that next generation of hedge before they start to decline. So this is a picture on the left of what a freshly laid hedge looks like. The stem is cut most of the way through. That's the strap that keeps the hedge going, and the hedge itself will still stay alive and regrow. And on the right, that is the regrowth that you get from the bottom of your hedge the following year. So you can see there's about 15 new stems coming from the bottom of that hedge. That is the regrowth. So not only does that bush your hedge out from the bottom, but that provides the next generation of hedge, allowing it to essentially live forever. It also fantastic for hedgehogs in that it recreates that cover. So if you get a hedge that gets a bit leggy, that laying process bushes it back out at the bottom, creates that shelter, that protective nature at the bottom of a hedge, which is exactly where things like hedgehogs need it. So laying a hedge, it might look dramatic. People come with chainsaws and, take quite a lot of material out. But it's actually the secret for hedge immortality. When we stop laying hedges, we lose them. And we've got national data to show how much we're losing hedges, largely because we stopped laying them. So traditionally, we laid hedges, we trimmed them, we let them up, and we laid them again. And that's all hedge management needs to be. We can shape that. So we need hedges for different reasons now. And the reason that you've got hedges is not necessarily to keep cows in. We've got different purposes for them. So actually this hedge cycle has an awful lot of flexibility. If we want our hedges to be neat and tidy, we can weight them towards that neat and tidy trimmed stage, as long as we know at some point we do need to go around this cycle to make sure that that hedge is in good shape in future years. So hedge layers, I actually think are a little bit like superheroes, because who else can claim to, with a chainsaw, create immortality? I think it's a fantastic process that we need to be rediscovering and teaching the nation about. We used to do it because hedges need to be restock proof to keep the sheep in, but now we need to do it to make sure that we keep providing that next generation of hedge. And this is largely where we went wrong with hedges. For as long as we've had hedges, we laid them once a generation until the war. After the wars, we didn't have enough people working the land to lay the hedges. And ever since then, their condition has been slowly declining until we get to now. And basically, we are flatlining our hedges. They are really struggling, as I'm sure you've noticed, in the countryside. And this is largely because it's been so long since they've been on that rejuvenation, that laying cycle. So management options in a nutshell. I hope I've stressed enough how important the rejuvenation section is. That is hedge laying or coppicing if hedge laying is out of the question. We do that once per generation. That is an absolute non-negotiable if we want our hedge to thrive into the future. As and where, I'm not entirely sure which campuses, which grounds are able to get DEFRA funding. I know some are, and I'm not sure whether all are, but there are capital grants that can support this kind of work. The routine management is how we manage our hedge between hedge laying events. And this could be anything between 15 or 40 years that we'll be doing the routine management for before we go back to that hedge laying again. So this could be incremental trimming, which again means you've always got the blossom and the berries. It could be rotational trimming as and where space allows, or it could be no or limited trimming, depending on what we need that hedge for, whether we need it for shelter, shade, or privacy, or just to guide people in the right direction. But how we routinely manage our hedge affects how frequently we need to do that rejuvenation. So it's worth thinking about that quite carefully. So we created an app basically that helps you understand this hedgerow management cycle. There's a bit of complexity to it, and you basically answer 6 questions, and it builds a map and gives you advice about what each hedgerow needs. My recommendation is always to take that advice and build it into a 10-year plan. Now, a 10-year plan is really important because it can spread the work, spread the costs, spread the impact. It creates a staggered system, which means you've got always hedges of each different shape and size. And it can actually make it easier for both for funding and for contractors, as well as easier logistically. There's an awful lot of consideration that might go into a 10-year hedgerow management plan, but let me know if that's something you're interested in, and we can discuss that when we've got a little bit more time. And in terms of what you want your hedges for, it's always worth starting with, why do I want this hedgerow to be there? And sometimes neatness and tidiness and aesthetics is important, and that's absolutely fine. It's fine to want it to look tidy. It's fine to weight your hedge towards that trimmed part of the life cycle. As long as we know that we can extend this phase with the right sensitive trimming management, but we can't keep it there indefinitely. If we keep it there indefinitely, this is what we'll see. We'll see the hedge slowly disappear, and it will go as each stem struggles and fails. Species choice is really important. In this photo, we've got one side is a beech hedgerow and the other side is a hornbeam hedge. Now, both of these species, whilst being sort of largely single species hedges, they both offer good branching density. And when they're trimmed well, they keep some of their dead leaves. They cling on to their dead leaves over winter. And this means that you've always got a physical barrier, you've always got a little bit of privacy, and you've always got shelter for wildlife there as well. It's worth understanding and noting that in some areas, space will be a limiting factor. You can't always get a hedge that's 4 meters high and 3 meters wide. So space might be a limiting factor. But whenever we plant a hedge, or whether we encroach onto the space of an existing one, we must always make sure that there is space for that full life cycle to occur. So we might never get our hedge to 3 meters wide and 4 meters tall. That's absolutely fine. But we do need to make sure that it does have space to thrive. Unfortunately, this hedgerow was at the side of a car park development, has a very poor prognosis. It doesn't have any space to grow and mature and go through their life cycle at all. And small hedges, I think it's worth repeating that small hedges aren't the only ones that look smart. And when aesthetics are a consideration, we can still have an aesthetically pleasing hedge that's on the larger side. So this hedge is cut annually. Every year this hedge is cut. It looks a bit lovely and wild because this is late summer, but yeah, cut every single year. Brownie points for this one being on an A shape, which is fantastic. And this one is also cut slightly bigger each year. This one is offering fantastic habitat, but also has a tidy appearance. I think it helps that it has a mown strip next to it. Mown strips, as we do in some sort of amenity grassland, can demonstrate an intentionality for wildlife-friendly management and demonstrate that this is a purposeful choice rather than neglect. So I should mention that we spoke about it at the beginning. We have collaborated with the Nature Friendly Grounds to create training modules for hedgerows to make sure that we've got good advice there for hedgehog friendly campuses, hedgehog friendly grounds, nature friendly grounds, to make sure that there's a simple steps of advice that you can follow to guide you in the right direction when it comes to your hedges. I am largely very optimistic about our hedges. I think they are gaining attention. People are understanding how very much they can do for us. So not just in terms of the practicality, the shade, the shelter, you know, keeping people to footpaths, you know, the privacy, all those sort of practical things, but actually how much they can deliver for wildlife when we allow them to, how much they can deliver for climate change when we allow them to. Nationally, we've got over 400,000 kilometres of hedges. And by tweaking the way we manage even just what we've got, we can make a huge, positive, rapid change with little or no encroachment to the lands that we use. Largely, the infrastructure is already there. And whilst it is a fantastic thing to be planting new hedges, I think we also need to be making sure we appreciate, manage and save the ones that we already have. Thank you. I will stop sharing now, but please do, if you have any questions, you can ask them now, or my email address is up on this slide. So if you have any questions later on, please do just get in touch. As you can probably tell, I'm always happy to chat about hedges.
Thank you so much, Megan. Really appreciate that. And it's